The man who once walked away without a second thought now stands at my door, wanting back into a life he abandoned. 2 years ago, I never would have imagined this moment. Travis, the man who left me while I was months pregnant, now seeking a connection with the son he legally relinquished all rights to. Rewind to the beginning, when things were different. I was 29, in a long-term relationship with Travis, and we had been together for nearly 3 years. We lived together for over a year and a half before I found out I was pregnant. Our story wasn't extraordinary, just two people who met through friends, built a connection, and enjoyed each other's company. He was charming, sweet, and easy to be around. But there was one thing about him that always lingered in the background: his obsession with money. At first, I brushed it off. He was frugal, sure, but I figured it was just his way of being responsible. In fact, I even admired his discipline. But soon, it became clear this wasn't about responsibility, it was an ingrained reluctance to spend a dime more than necessary. He cut costs wherever possible, from food to toiletries to the very furniture in his house, which all looked like it had been salvaged from the side of the road. When we started dating, I rarely spent time at his place, so I never noticed how extreme it was. My apartment was our usual hangout spot. But when my lease ended, too expensive to renew, it made sense to move in with him. That's when reality hit. Living with Travis meant living in a space where everything was the bare minimum, and I struggled to adjust. At first, I tried to ignore it. But the more I looked around, the more I felt suffocated. Eventually, I spoke up. He resisted, of course, he did, but I wore him down. I convinced him that upgrading his home wasn't a waste of money but an investment in our future. We would split the costs evenly, and that reassured him. Over the next 3 months, I transformed that place, replacing his old, battered belongings with quality pieces that made the home feel warm and welcoming. I thought I was doing us both a favor. I thought he would see it that way, too. I was wrong. That's when the resentment began. He saw my efforts not as improvements but as control, a selfish need to impose my will on him. Every argument led back to the same accusation: he had changed his entire lifestyle for me. It became his trump card, a way to silence me whenever we fought. Never mind that I paid for half of everything or that we were splitting rent. To him, I should have been grateful that he sacrificed for me. Despite it all, we stayed together. I told myself relationships had rough patches, that this was just one of them. And when things were good, they were amazing. I wasn't ready to give up on us, not yet. Neither was he, or so I thought. Then came the pregnancy, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt perfect. Travis was ecstatic. He promised we'd marry as soon as he got his long-awaited promotion. It wasn't an official engagement, no ring, no formal proposal, but it was enough. I believed him. I loved him. And I thought, no matter what, we would build a future together. But love alone isn't always enough. When I hit 3 months, I had to step away from my job. Being a contractor was physically demanding, and the stress was unbearable. I had only been with the company for a few months, which meant my maternity leave wasn't covered. That's when everything started to unravel. My company didn't offer paid maternity leave for employees who had been there for less than a year. That meant I wouldn't see a paycheck until I went back to work. I had talked about it with Travis, and he assured me that he would take care of everything. I had nothing to worry about. I told him I'd still contribute however I could, but splitting the rent was out of the question. That was my biggest expense, and until our baby was born, I had to be cautious with money. There would be so many things to think about once the baby arrived. So, we agreed, until I returned to work, he would handle the rent. That was the plan, and I thought we were on the same page. 2 months passed, and for a while, things seemed fine. Travis was still hopeful about a promotion at work. But then, one day, he came home looking crushed. Someone else had been chosen instead. He was devastated. That word didn't even begin to cover it. The following weeks were pure misery. His disappointment turned into something darker. He started drinking, a lot. And he didn't try to hide it. Every evening, he'd come home and drown himself in alcohol like he was trying to forget the world. I lived on edge, fearing what might happen next. I tried to get him to slow down, but he brushed me off. "I'm not hurting anyone," he said. "So why should it matter?" I was exhausted all the time, physically and emotionally. I didn't have the strength to argue. Besides, Travis had become impossible to talk to, constantly irritable, snapping at me over the smallest things. I hoped it was just a phase, that he'd come around. But it only got worse. Around my 5th month of pregnancy, he cut back on the drinking, but his temper remained. He still snapped at me whenever I tried to talk. I stayed. I clung to hope. Maybe things would get better. I told myself it was temporary. Besides, where would I go? My parents lived in another city. My friends had their own lives. I didn't want to burden them. And I was having a child with this man. I needed to believe we could make it work. Then, one evening, he came home and dropped a bombshell. He said we needed to start splitting the rent again. Just like that. He told me he wasn't getting a raise anymore and couldn't handle the expenses alone. I was stunned. I had already gone on leave, and by that point, I was heavily pregnant. I got tired so easily, it would be impossible for me to return to work now. I reminded him that it was just 2 more months before I'd be back. Couldn't he wait just a little longer? But he shut me down. He said he'd been struggling for months and couldn't do it anymore. I thought he was joking. I mean, how could he possibly expect a 7-month pregnant woman, carrying his child, to go back to work just so he wouldn't have to spend a little extra money? I told him he was being unfair. We had already agreed on this. He had promised. And it wasn't like I expected him to cover everything. I still paid for groceries and bills. I wasn't freeloading. But he wouldn't budge. Then, he said something that changed everything. Either I started paying rent or I could leave. I froze. He was serious. This wasn't just some cruel joke. When we moved in together, this was supposed to be our home. Sure, the lease was in his name, but I had treated it like ours. And now he was telling me to leave? While I was carrying his child. It was so absurd, I couldn't even process it. I told him to calm down and think rationally. He refused. His mind was made up. I snapped. The argument exploded into a full-blown shouting match. We yelled at each other for what felt like forever. But I was exhausted. Physically, emotionally, everything in me just broke. I gave up. I started packing my things. I was humiliated. How had it come to this? And then, as if to twist the knife deeper, he threw it in my face, how much he had changed his life for me. How unfair it was that I expected so much while giving nothing in return. Nothing. He actually believed I had done nothing for him. It was more than insulting. It was heartbreaking. I loved him. And he saw me as a burden. I couldn't stay. So, I packed my clothes and left. I moved in with my friend Banna. I didn't want to impose, but I had nowhere else to go. I tried to explain what had happened without breaking down, but the tears wouldn't stop. I cried harder than I ever had. I was shattered. Banna, bless her, didn't hesitate. She told me I could stay as long as I needed. No rent, no expectations, just a safe place. We had been roommates in college, and I already knew she was a good person. But during my pregnancy, she did more for me than Travis ever did. Before I moved in with her, I had to attend every single appointment with my gynecologist. I went alone. Travis was always too busy, always had something else to do. But Brianna? She never let me face anything by myself. She stood beside me through it all. Even when I went into labor, she was right there, holding my hand, making sure I knew I wasn't alone. She even opened her home to my parents, allowing them to visit me every single day in those 2 weeks leading up to my due date. Who does that? Who welcomes someone else's family into their life like that? Since then, she's been more than a friend, she's family. My parents even call her the sister I never had, and honestly, I couldn't agree more. And Travis? He was practically a ghost in my life after I left. We never had an official breakup, no dramatic last words. I walked out of that house, expecting, hoping, that he'd call, ask me to come back, tell me he cared. But the phone never rang. Weeks passed. Then I discovered he had blocked me. Not just me, but all of our mutual friends too. Why? What was the need for such extremes? The message was clear, he wanted nothing to do with me. Even when I went into labor, I tried to reach him. Desperation made me turn to his parents, even though I hadn't spoken to them since the argument that tore everything apart. Before that, they used to check in on me almost weekly, but now? Silence. Still, I thought they had the right to know, and maybe, just maybe, they'd tell Travis. So I called. I kept it short, simply letting them know which hospital I'd be at. I didn't expect much, but I wasn't prepared for nothing. No response. No one showed up. His mother's voice on the phone had been distant, cold, indifferent. And when no one from his family arrived, I realized that indifference was real. They didn't care. Not her husband. And definitely not Travis. When I finally held my son in my arms, the only people by my side were my parents and Brianna. Looking back, I'm grateful. I didn't need Travis, not really. But in that moment, fresh from the pain of labor, exhausted beyond words, it hurt. The weight of his absence crushed me. He didn't just abandon me, he abandoned his own child. I tried to be strong. I told myself there was no going back now. That much was obvious. I was a single mother, and Travis? He couldn't have cared less. But that night, when I came home from the hospital, I broke down. I cried until there were no more tears left. And then? I made a decision. If he didn't want to be in his son's life, then he wouldn't be, legally. I wasn't going to give him a chance to walk in and out as he pleased. He had to be out. Permanently. I told Brianna and my parents about my decision, and they stood by me, no questions asked. We found a lawyer, someone experienced in handling cases like this. Papers were drawn up, and just a week after giving birth, I paid Travis a visit. I didn't waste time. I placed the documents in front of him, laid everything out as plainly as possible. If he didn't want to be involved, this was his exit. All he had to do was sign, and that would be it, forever. He barely hesitated. That hurt more than I expected. But it was necessary. He signed. And just like that, he was gone. No more what-ifs, no more waiting for him to step up. I didn't ask for child support. I didn't want anything from him. I knew how stingy he was, how he would make a whole spectacle of it if I dared to ask for money. Instead, I threw myself into work, determined to provide for my son on my own. Brianna, as always, was a rock. I went back to work just a few months after giving birth, dipping into my savings to contribute to our shared expenses. She never asked for it, never made me feel like a burden, but I needed to pull my weight. She wasn't earning much more than me, and yet she never once complained about supporting both me and my child. Meanwhile, my parents made a big move. They rented out our old family home and relocated to be closer to me. It wasn't easy, rent was much higher here, but they found a small apartment near Brianna's place. They wanted me to move in with them, but surprisingly, it was Brianna who asked me to stay. She had grown attached to my son, to me, to the little family we had built together. So we stayed. With my parents helping with childcare while Brianna and I worked, things fell into place. Life settled into a rhythm. I got so caught up in the whirlwind of work and motherhood that, before I even realized it, I had stopped thinking about Travis. Then, out of nowhere, I heard from some old friends, Travis was dating again. I braced myself for the sting, the familiar ache in my chest. But nothing came. No anger, no sadness, not even a twinge of jealousy. Just nothing. 2 years passed. Being a single mother wasn't easy, but it was infinitely better than being with someone who never cared. Recently, I moved into my own apartment. Brianna had started seeing someone, and though she never said it outright, I knew the dynamic had to change. It was tough, for both of us, but it was time. We still lived close, still saw each other every weekend. Some things never changed. Life was good. I had my son, my family, my own space. I didn't miss Travis. Not even a little. And then, just a week ago, there was a knock on my door. I opened it. And there he was. Travis. Looking at me like he had something to say. Like he wanted back in. Like the last 2 years had never happened. He stood at my doorstep, his face a mixture of desperation and determination. He said he had tracked down my address through a mutual friend. After countless failed dates and a long period of self-reflection, he had finally realized the gravity of his mistake. He wanted me back. More than that, he wanted to be a father to the son he had never met. The audacity! Did he really expect me to welcome him with open arms, no questions asked? I scoffed, told him he was no longer welcome in my life, and began shutting the door in his face. But he wedged his foot in, refusing to leave. "I'm not going anywhere until I see my son," he declared. His voice wavered between frustration and entitlement. "It's unfair for you to keep him from me. I've never even laid eyes on him. He's 2 years old. Don't you think I deserve to meet my own child at least once?" I almost laughed at how absurd this was. He had signed away his parental rights. I had the legal documents to prove it. He was nothing more than a stranger now, and yet here he was, trying to guilt me into undoing his own decision. "You made your choice 2 years ago," I reminded him coldly. "You walked away, and you don't get to waltz back in just because you suddenly feel ready." He tried another tactic, one meant to paint me as the villain. "If you're a good mother, you'd put our son first, not your resentment toward me. Don't punish him because of your anger toward me." Oh, the irony. Now he wanted to lecture me on what a good parent should do. The same man who abandoned me during my pregnancy? Who never once checked in to see if his child had food, shelter, or even a name? I met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "He's not your son anymore. He's mine. You signed your rights away. You have no claim to him. And if you don't leave, I'll call the cops." I slammed the door in his face. For 5 agonizing minutes, he rang the doorbell, knocking insistently, but I refused to give in. Eventually, he left. But guilt crept in, uninvited. I talked to my parents and my best friend, Brianna. They all agreed I owed him nothing. But what about my son? Was I doing the right thing for him? Then, there was another complication: Travis's parents. They wouldn't stop calling. They sent me video messages, sobbing apologies for how they treated me years ago. They admitted they had been blinded by their emotions, dealing with their own struggles at the time. Now, they had come to their senses, and they wanted to make amends. "He deserves to know his father," they pleaded. "One day, he'll ask about him. How will you explain that his father wanted to be in his life, but you refused? Don't make a mistake you'll regret." I didn't need them to remind me of my son's future questions. I had thought about them myself, endlessly. They admitted Travis had made a colossal mistake, but they insisted that, as a mother, I should forgive him, for my son's sake. Travis, too, had unblocked me and flooded my inbox with messages. He wasn't just asking to see his son, he wanted me back. "I know you're angry, but I also know you still love me. You'll come around. I'll wait." I was drowning in the weight of this decision. Was I wrong? Was I selfish? Or was I protecting my child from inevitable heartbreak? Update 1. After countless sleepless nights, I made my decision. Travis was not coming back into my life. And as for my son, he wouldn't meet his father until he was old enough to understand what had happened. I settled on 5 years old. That was when I would sit him down and tell him the truth. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best I could do. I told Travis. Surprisingly, he accepted it. To those calling me cruel for keeping my son from his father, where was his father when I was giving birth? When I was holding our newborn alone in the hospital? If fairness is the argument, then we're even. To those who supported me, thank you. Your words meant more than you know. To the ones who judged me harshly, perhaps it's time to reflect on your own biases. Update 2. 2 days later, the backlash from Travis's parents was relentless. 5 years was too long, they argued. A boy needs his father. Funny. They didn't think a pregnant woman needed support when she was carrying that boy. They had no issue ignoring me back then. But now? Now, they had all the opinions in the world. Travis told me to block them if necessary, but their accusations cut deep. They claimed I was being vindictive, using my son as a pawn for revenge. You're punishing Travis, not thinking about your child's best interests. The sheer audacity of it. I wanted to lash out, but I held back. They weren't worth my energy. If they wanted to believe I was selfish, let them. The truth didn't need their validation. Update 3. A month passed. A slow, complicated, and emotional month. Travis and I came to an agreement. He would financially contribute to his son's upbringing. He would try to prove himself as a father. Trust was fragile between us, but we were trying. Would I introduce him to our son this year? Maybe. I wasn't making any promises. But I wasn't slamming the door shut completely either. Travis had been apologetic, repeatedly expressing regret for the past. And honestly, I was tired of carrying all the burden alone. If he was finally willing to step up, why reject his help? So here we are. Taking it slow. Trying to rebuild. Not for us. For our son.